Welcome back and hello again. Our next presenter, Laura Madsen, is an accomplished author, speaker, and practitioner in the area of data governance. And she's going to be fulfilling us with how data agility can really help enable data centricity. Take it away, Laura.
Well, hello everyone. I was enamored a bit by the Max Headroom Devo hat thing. I wanted more. I wanted more information about the Max Headroom Devo hat thing because it was a great time. So anyway, thank you for having me. I am indeed Laura Madsen, and I'm here today to talk a little bit about Agile data governance. We only have 30 minutes, and there's a fair amount to cover. And unfortunately, you can see me, but I can't see you. So I'll try to pace myself. But I understand that we have some great opportunity for questions and answers. Well, at least some questions right after this session. So today we're going to talk about a couple of things when it comes to very specifically data governance and agile data governance. But we're first going to, of course, start off with this idea of a data-centric approach, because I am a big advocate of the idea that the only reason that we do any of this is because of the data. And then we're going to talk a little bit about agility and how it theoretically should increase the value. And we're going to talk about how to balance democratization with trust. And that is a very tricky thing, and I get a lot of questions about that, so we'll probably spend just a couple extra minutes on that. And we're going to talk about creating definitions, which has typically been sort of the bread and butter of data governance or traditional data governance mechanisms in organizations, and how we can do that better. And then we'll cover a couple of lessons learned from agile deployments of data governance. So that's our agenda for today. But next up, I want to cover a minute about a note on agility. First, as a disclaimer, I am not an agile coach. I am not a scrum master. I've not been formally trained. I happen to be a big advocate of agile methods, but it is agile with a little a, not agile with a big A. And I think this is critically important because what I'm most interested in is this idea that we will remove all the extraneous process activities to get to the core of the work. The reason we're doing any of it, whether it's traditional project management and waterfall or following agile methods, is because we really want to deliver capabilities. And historically, when we've had more waterfall methods, we've created checklists in our organization to prove that we're doing work. And that's where the flaming hoops comes from. So this idea here that we had to jump through a whole bunch of flaming hoops to prove that we were actually doing the work versus just delivering the work. And I really like the idea, at least at the core of agile methods, that we were removing the extraneous process steps to really talk about delivering the work. And that's what we're going to cover today. But first, on our next slide, we are going to focus on this data centricity. And I want to tell you a little story about Bill the Architect. It's story time. And so a little story about Bill the Architect. So in my career, I've worked with a lot of data architects. And there's a number of things that data architects have in common. One of them is I couldn't pry a whiteboard marker out of their hand if I tried. I could use heavy equipment, but generally speaking, they are going to have a whiteboard marker in their hand and they're going to be at the whiteboard. But the interesting thing about Bill the Architect was he loved a good whiteboard, don't get me wrong. But the other critical thing about Bill the Architect was he was the first one that really came to me and said, without any hesitation, like what I'm worried about here, Laura, is the data. He focused on the data. He built everything around the data. He spent more time doing data profiling and data modeling than he did almost anything else. And while it seems a little bit counterintuitive because you'd think that most architects would do it that way, he really put a much more specific emphasis on being very data-centric. And one of the things that I loved about the way he approached things was, look, the data is as it is. And what we often have spent so much time in, particularly in data warehousing, we've spent so much time thinking about how do we fix the data? How do we clean the data? How do we prevent data from getting into the wrong hands the wrong way? And we spent so much time doing that. I used to talk all the time about how ETL, extract, transform, and load, is 80% of the work that we would do. And he turned that on its head for me and just said, look, the data is the data is. And we're going to work with data. We're going to take a very data-centric approach. And because of the way that he pushed me a little bit further and more significantly in that data-centric approach, is how I started to think about data governance, particularly agile data governance or disrupting data governance. And this idea that in order to really deliver a lot of value to our organizations, we first had to remove the barriers, which is where agility comes in. But then second, we really had to put a laser focus on the data, and the rest of the stuff would fall in line. But in order to deliver real value to your organization, that's really the only place you can start. So next slide, we will talk a little bit about this idea of agility and value. So of course, you know, the interesting thing about agile methods, and probably most methods, but agile in particular, is if you want to get a very good argument going amongst people, start talking about agile and how, you know, everybody thinks that it's the panacea and it's going to solve problems and blah, 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 blah. And, you know, I think the critical thing about agile when we talk about particularly data governance, but data in general, is agile in and of itself does not provide value. But neither does project management or waterfall in and of itself. They're communication methods, they're important checklists, they help us explain things to people, but you know, your executives don't generally like really get excited about some of those pieces. Agile is a mechanism, and it does not necessarily solve the problem that you have, but what it can do is provide visibility. I'm looking at my notes. It provides visibility that is really supposed to be, you know, sort of the partner along with what you're delivering. So this idea of having, it's very much throwing me off that I can't see your faces. Sorry. So agility in and of itself does not provide value, right? But what does provide value is that visibility that is supposed to be concomitant with agility. And that's where we start talking about backlogs and sprint cycles and getting demo days in there and having people look at things with you and co-locating teams and all those kinds of things. One of the best things, of course, about agility in my mind is that it does reduce this idea of flaming hoops, which we talked about a little bit ago. But what I don't want people to think is, I don't want people to think that because you are doing agile, whatever that means to you, that you're providing value, because you're not. Because at the end of the day, for your organization, the value comes from the data, right? And in our world for data governance, we really have to focus on this concept of usage of the data. That's where the value is. But for so long, from a data governance perspective, we really stood in front of that data. And we really focused very much on making sure that we only delivered data that was clean and of high quality, which don't even get me started, because there's no such thing as clean data. We focused on data that we defined, and we had this weird inclination that we would define data once and for all time, and everybody would use that definition, right? But the problem is that no organization stays static, right? There is no organization that thinks about their customers the way they did 20 years ago. Or if they do, Blockbuster, then you know, maybe they're not around anymore. Data is fluid, and your definitions and how you govern it and how you think about quality and how you think about context all needs to be fluid as well, which is, again, another reason why I think agility matches data governance extremely well. But don't get me wrong, there's nothing valuable about agility in and of itself. The agility is a mechanism to provide value to your organization. So let's talk a little bit about So we're data-centric, we're talking about Agile methods, and now we need to talk a little bit about this concept of trust and democratization. I'm going to step back for just a minute and explain why I'm talking about trust and democratization. So I wrote a book a year ago or so called Disrupting Data Governance. And in the book, I propose that, that data governance is dumb. In that we are using very similar methods for data governance that we did 20, 30 years ago when the early forms of the data warehouse started. And when I talk about the early forms of data warehouse, I'm talking about your average companies being able to use a data warehouse, not the IBMs and 3Ms and United Health Groups of the world, but I'm talking about where they became very ubiquitous. And out of that first sort of big push around data warehouses sprung this idea of data governance, this idea of data ownership and stewardship. And it was very feasible at that point to be able to, quote unquote, govern your data, because you had a data warehouse that had maybe 100 tables in it and maybe hundreds of thousands of rows. But it was really feasible to have some primary data domains, a handful of named data stewards, and you could get pretty close to what looked like a governed state at that point. But fast forward a number of decades, and we have this big data concept, right? And I'm not going to talk about big data because that's neither here nor there. But the whole point is we no longer have data warehouses that have 50 tables or 100 tables in them with a couple 100,000 rows. We have petabytes of data coming at us every second. And there is no way that in a traditional data governance activity, you could govern data that way. It's just not feasible. Yet all of our methods for data governance still create data owners, and there's a whole bunch of committees, and there's data stewards, and we're going to protect and make sure that data people only see the data that's correct and clean based on this one definition that we created 2 years ago. And everybody has to use that same definition. And of course, one of my favorite things to say is, spending so much time in healthcare, I certainly hope that a nurse manager doesn't define a patient the same way that the finance manager would. We don't want that. We want to be fluid. We need to be able to have the ability to flex with the data and to flex with the needs of the organization. So a big part of the book, Disrupting Data Governance, was this idea of democratization and ensuring that we open the coffers a little bit from a data perspective. And I get a lot of questions about this and a lot of terror, if you will, from people that are used to managing data functions. About this idea, well, you can't just open up the coffers and just let people use data, from a democratization perspective. Well, hell's going to break loose. Well, and that's where this teeter-totter comes in. It's a fulcrum, right? There's a balance there. And it's much more a teeter-totter than it is the scales of justice. But we've got to be able to democratize access to our data. Because the primary point of creating anything, whether it's a data warehouse or dashboards, whether we're data-centric or app-centric or whatever, right? The whole purpose is providing data because it is an asset to our organizations. But in order to do that well, you have to democratize some access to it because, again, these functions, these entities are entirely too large for a small data governance team somewhere in your IT department or somewhere buried off in your analytics department to be able to govern it as a whole. So we have to balance letting people use it with the trust that requires. And the flip side is then how do they trust us, right? So this is where we have to find a happy medium there as we start to talk about opening up the coffers. And some of this really for data professionals is probably the hardest and most difficult thing. We are so used to locking down our data and preventing people from seeing things because we are worried that they're going to do dumb things with data. And we all have examples of end users, business users, stakeholders doing dumb things with data. And that's going to happen. There's just no way of preventing that. Because if you try to prevent it, and if you try to lock it down, and you try to only present like this perfect thing, they're going to find ways around you. And then pretty soon the thing that they created becomes the default, often termed spread mart, right? And then that becomes the source. And then you're trying to run over and figure out what to do with that and stop something dumb from coming. You can't do that. You're not a police officer. That's not your job. You're not the data police. Your job is to make sure that you provide as much access, usage, not access from a privacy perspective, as possible to the data so that people can use it. And when they use it and they do something dumb with it, that's a learning moment, right? It's like parenting. This is a perfect learning moment for you to say, hey, look what happened. And how can we fix this together? And most of the work here about ensuring that you create a great fulcrum, a great balance between trust and democratization, is how you respond in that moment when something terrible happens because somebody did something quote unquote dumb with the data, right? I actually don't think there's anything dumb with the data because it means they're asking questions. And if they're asking questions, that means that they're using it. And if they're using it, that means they're finding value in it. And if they're finding value in it, then that means that you have job security. And those are the things that are really important. So I just encourage, as we think about democratization of data, and we think about Agile, and we think about how we're going to reconstruct our data governance teams, that we recognize that there's always going to be a balance here with how much do we let out versus how much do we keep in, and where does that trust come from? And how can you do an enthusiastic job of when people bring you questions or concerns, you say, yes, they're using the data. Now we just got to solve a different problem. So as we think about solving some different problems, let's take a next step over to our MVP land. And I'm sure many of you know now in Agile speak, MVP means most valuable or most viable product. And for data governance for a very long time, this MVP was the definitions, right? Data definitions. And for most of my careers, I've led data governance functions. As I've thought about data governance for writing the books, I've led Agile data governance deployments. This is at the core of what we do. And it really is helping the organization provide context associated with some of their primary data domains. A great example is customer, right? Product, vendor, employee, all those things, those primary data domains. And the crazy thing is we do have to have definitions. The downside is, from a data governance perspective, we would historically, get a committee in place, right? And we'd spend a whole bunch of time and we'd talk about it and we'd challenge all kinds of things, and eventually we'd come up with a pretty much a definition that we had initially, right? And what I would encourage you to think about as we start talking about the core bread and butter of data governance, this MVP is a working definition, not a data definition for end all be all time, right? I don't want one definition of customer for everybody to use in all instances. What I care about is one definition of customer that you use when you're comparing across something, whether that be departments, floors, units, campuses. That's the only time you should really care that there's a consistent definition for something. But if you have the finance department off and they're using a different definition of customer and they're just doing it in their department, who cares? Let them do it. If they're coming to the executive table and they all have to make a decision about something associated with customer, well, then they have to use the standard definition, right? But it really is about comparison. And that's what I really want you to focus on when you start thinking about creating standard definitions. So again, how long is too long? So how long does it really take to come up with a definition of data, of any kind of term in your organization? And I've been around long enough to know that it takes an enormous amount of time, way longer than it should. But when I was writing the book, I interviewed a number of people, and I was talking to a CIO of an organization. It was a hospital, and we were just kind of comparing notes, and she told me that it took them 18 months to come up with a definition of patient. And now, just to be super clear here, right? We're talking about definition for weight of a patient, which means it has a lot to do with drugs, right? And how much drug is given to a patient at any given time. I'm not saying it's not important. But my question to her was, well, if it took you 18 months to define it, what did you use during that time? During those 18 months? How did you define weight? because it probably was pretty good, right? I mean, not to be flippant, but from a healthcare perspective, a lot of those metrics are standard in terms of how you report them back in case something terrible happens. So 18 months to define something is a really long time if you're already using something that is pretty good and you have standard metrics that you have to report on if something terrible happens. So the whole idea here is that sometimes there's a lot of value in getting people together, right, about creating an ownership around a definition. But the reality is, while you're doing that, somebody's using a definition already. So if we think about this idea of a working definition, time box that effort. Don't take for perpetuity, right? Don't take 18 months. Don't ask 378 people, because you need something now to create a baseline and to talk through. So time box your effort, because you probably already know the answer, and really talk about and create communication and buy-in with that working definition, right? Because you can do that. You can create a working definition. You can ensure that that data actually exists and validate the sources and that the data is pretty decent quality, all those good things. And then you start to socialize that definition, and then you set it and you say, this is the definition we're going to use. And then you also identify, like, hey, we're going to review this in like 6 months, right? Just like a code review. You know, you're going to take a look at my code in 6 months because things change and things improve. All right. So that's what we really want to make that shift to from a data definition perspective, and that MVP of standard data definitions. So when we think about great ways of lessons learned associated with data governance, but certainly aspects of data governance like definitions, like data quality, right? Because obviously data quality is part of data governance. There's a term or a saying in Agile that I really appreciate, and it applies very much to data governance, and that is think big, start small, and act fast. So your thinking big is Agile, right? We're going to use Agile data governance, but we're going to think big around data governance. How are we thinking about data governance as an organization? In the book, I talk about the 4 categories of data governance. So you have this big, like, okay, here's how we're going to approach data governance. That's your think big. But then you got to start small. And when I want you to, in this way of thinking about that, I want you to think about starting small as a backlog. And all a backlog is a list of stuff to do. That's it. I don't want you to write a dissertation. You don't have to go to school to write definitions of done or exit criteria, whatever you call it. I want you to open up Excel and write down everything you've ever thought about doing for data governance. Boom, 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 boom. Start a backlog. That's what I want you to do. I do need you to consistently document in that backlog exit criteria or definitions of done, and t-shirt size. You know, is this small, medium, or it's not going to get done till I retire, right? Maybe identify a couple of key resources that you might want in the mix. And then just edit and manage that backlog, right? Because that's what you do in Agile. It's a list of things to do. But what you really need to kind of keep thinking about is this visibility, this communication, this buy-in, removing all those extra barriers, those flaming hoops. What really matters is you're talking about the list of things that are on your data governance backlog. And that provides a lot more of that visibility, which is where really the value from these activities come through. And of course, the famous progress over perfection. And it's funny because a couple of months ago, I was talking to an architect, and he said to me, he's like, honest to God, I don't even know what progress over perfection means. And if one more person says it to me, I'm probably going to lose my stuff. And I really appreciated his honesty, because I think that's true. And I think, you know, in 30 minutes, there's a lot of buzzwords here. There's a lot of things that aren't being said. And progress over perfection is one of those things. But the whole idea here is that we have to make a start. Because in order to drive and provide value to our organizations, we have to make sure that they can use the data. But in order to make sure that they can use the data in a way that makes everybody feel comfortable using the data, there has to be aspects of governance to do that. And what we've thought about data governance for a really long time was so locked down.